Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura and I'm joined by Antonia and Jasmin to talk about glass, whether we can be using or recycling more of it and what the alternative may be. Now, I've seen lots of news articles that seem to be talking about plans to increase glass bottle recycling rates, and these plans seem to be controversial. One is that a new deposit return scheme in England won't include glass bottles. So, Antonia, what do you know about the deposit return scheme?
I've come across the deposit return scheme in Germany, and I found out in a rather abrupt way, to be honest. Me and my friends were buying some beverages. I can't remember what kind of packaging it was, whether it was glass or plastic or cans, but the amount that was labelled above the item was not what they asked us to pay at the cashier, and they just kept telling me, just pay it.
And because you went from there, you wanted to understand why. I assume that was the deposit for the
Yeah,
container.
it was the deposit for the container, and I would get it back if I brought it back, but it was just so well established that no one explained it.
Oh, that's a shame. You'd think if they're that well aware of it that they should be able to explain why it exists, but I guess maybe they just figured it's just a thing we do. We don't
I
need to
think
explain.
I think at that point it's just like that. No one questions why we have value added tax. It's just there.
True.
So yeah, it's been going on for ages.
Yeah, and I can see that having an amount that you then get back when you return the container makes a lot of sense to incentivize people to recycle. But Jasmine, am I right in thinking this is part of something called the extended producer responsibility, which is also known as polluter pays?
So technically, extended producer responsibility is a type of polluter pays principle, which includes others. But pays is essentially it's a concept in environmental policy where the person or party that is responsible for producing pollution, so carbon emissions, or in the case of beverage bottles, litter, and they have to pay or take some kind of financial responsibility for the pollution that they'll cause. Other types of polluter pays principles are the deposit return schemes for packaging.
Oh, okay, so there are a lot of different complexities out there for the packaging people.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Can you tell me more about this?
The deposit return is interesting in comparison with other polluter pays principles in that it's very targeted and specific. So most deposit return schemes focus entirely on bottles. It's the consumer that is financially responsible.
We've seen like glass deposits at festivals as well.
Yeah.
So sometimes people keep the glass and essentially they've kind of paid for it because they took it home, or they get like £2 or £3 back when they return it.
Are these the sort of things that you would keep as a souvenir from the festival?
Yeah, I think they would be. They're not just like single-use items.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, but you never know.
So I guess that sort of suggests they're high value if they're not just use it once and then chuck it away.
Yeah, and we've seen it with the plastic bag charge that was introduced to the UK.
Over 10 years ago?
I can't even remember.
I feel like it was more than 10 years ago.
Similar to Germany, we just accept it.
Yeah.
And that's what happens.
Yeah. It's interesting because is the consumer always the polluter?
I kind of feel like if you have got a thing from a shop and you have used it, it is your responsibility to then dispose of it correctly. You would see plastic bags like floating down the street, wouldn't you? Then attaching themselves to trees and whatever else, which made it then really difficult to get hold of.
Or if you remember the Katy Perry song,
Firework.
Okay.
No.
Well, this may be controversial, but I'm not a huge Katy Perry fan, so I don't think I'd be able to tell you the lyrics from any one of her songs. Maybe we should just move on.
Yeah, so we've got the plastic bag charge, which I think the retailers can just do what they want with the money once they get paid for the plastic bag. So it's a little bit different from the deposit return scheme.
Yeah, it is different in that you don't get your money back if you return the bag.
It's true, you paid for the bag in that case. So
you own the bag.
Yeah, but it did stop people from just getting bags at the supermarket just for the sake of it, didn't it? Because you suddenly had to pay for something that you effectively considered rubbish.
Yeah, if you're just used to something being for free and then it's like 5p, 10p, you're like, maybe I don't need a bag.
Yeah, just take my own. Keep using the one that I've already got. But this deposit return scheme that I started hearing about not so long ago, the news story said that including glass bottles in the deposit return scheme would increase complexity, but it didn't really explain what that meant. And I assumed it's just because the glass is heavier and more fragile than plastic, so it's more difficult to handle. But it goes in our curbside recycling and collection bins all the time, so I didn't quite understand that point.
Yeah, so in general, the government wants to increase recycling rates of single-use drink containers because it's currently about 70%, and they're hoping that a deposit return scheme would increase it to 90%. That would reduce a lot of litter.
The idea of a deposit return scheme is fairly new to the UK, so it's not entirely certain how much extra it's going to cost for like drinks that come in bottles or aluminium cans, but 20p per bottle is usually floated around.
And I guess maybe the complexity comes from, do we price things differently? Glass is heavier and generally more expensive, so are they going to put a higher deposit on that and, vary it by size of container? But then would that be too confusing for the consumer and they just want a flat rate of 20p for whatever it is?
True. I still would have assumed you could just apply that amount to any container regardless of what it's made from, but maybe I'm missing something. There is something that I read, and I can't find this information anymore. It was when I first started looking into this months ago, but the idea behind the deposit return scheme was partly based on what ends up as litter in the streets, which is either in a bin or just floating around on the grass or down the curbside or whatever. Apparently, 55% of litter by volume is plastic and metal drinks containers, but less than 4% is glass bottles. So I think part of the justification for having a deposit return scheme in general is it would help out local authorities who would ultimately have to dispose of the waste that's in the street or on the bin, and the deposit return scheme would incentivize people that don't already recycle or are maybe less responsible with their waste and don't mind it floating around out there, would make them do something with it. It could be that one reason that glass is excluded is that there's so little of the litter on the street being glass.
There was an impact assessment by DEFRA that estimated how much money goes into just tidying up litter in general.
So is that part of the reason for doing it, the cost-benefit analysis? It's like, yes, the scheme will cost this much to implement, but we'll save this much money.
Yes. There is a net financial benefit to having a deposit return scheme, not just because they've taken in revenue from the deposit, but they'll save money from not having to pick it up off the streets.
Fair enough. So I will say that it looks like very little of the glass litter near me, and there is a lot of it, is ever picked up, because some of it has been sitting there for years from what I can tell. I've swept some of it to the side of the path and it still sits there in a pile.
Nice.
Apparently, the UK spends £560 million tidying up litter.
Is that a lot in the grand scheme of local authority budgets? This is a bit of a side point, I think. Because it sounds like a lot, it's millions of pounds. But is it, if you put it in context?
Total revenue expenditure by local authorities in England is budgeted to be £130.8 billion in 2024 to 2025.
So that's like more than a third on picking up litter?
That does seem like a lot in that case. That's worrying, I guess.
And allegedly, a third of local authority expenditure in England is to education.
So we're spending as much picking up litter as we are educating our
allegedly.
Children. Nice.
We're definitely spending more than on police.
Well, that's not good.
See this? Yeah, I guess your point about education, again, it makes me wonder about glass. Why specifically exclude glass? What's so different about it?
Potentially one part of the reasons why glass is excluded is because the representative body for the glass industry in the UK did write an open letter to the government opposing including glass bottles in the deposit return scheme. Their main arguments were that because there's already like curbside collection for glass, if you had another recycling scheme, it would confuse people and could be and they did have some points on people who pay a deposit for their glass bottles. They would probably want it back, but they don't have the means to get to a recycling point where they can claim their deposit back. They're probably not going to recycle their bottles, or potentially may not recycle their bottles because they don't have the financial incentive to do so. British Glass also had concerns that a deposit return scheme could make glass beverages more expensive, and therefore people would buy less glass beverages, and therefore it would increase plastic bottled beverages.
But doesn't that entire argument also apply to other materials that you would put a drink in? It seems odd to me, because British Glass are advocating for the glass industry. They don't care what plastics and metals are doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because in other countries that have deposit return schemes, glass is included, and it has really impacted recycling rates for drinks beverages.
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. Recycling rates in countries that already have deposit return schemes are much higher than what they were pre-deposit return schemes.
And Wales is going to keep it in their scheme.
Yes.
It's England, Ireland, and Scotland that have differed.
Yes.
Okay, so British Glass saying keep it out because it would be confusing is essentially just creating a bit more confusion because it differs depending on where you are in the UK. Marvellous.
Yes. So just to put into context of what reducing glass littering could look like, if we managed to capture 90%, it would, just in Scotland, allow 504 million glass bottles every year to be recycled. And that's an increase from whatever it is now to 90%. So it's not like from 0 to 90% having that much more of an impact. Yeah, that would save 1.2 million tonnes of carbon emissions over the next 25 years.
Fair enough. I'd also read that the deposit return scheme could reduce glass littering by 85% if glass were included, which I would prefer because, as I say, there's a lot of broken glass on the streets near me. And my dog has cut his paw on it, and neighbours' dogs have as well. So I think it would make sense. And I found statistics about household recycling rates. So in the UK, by mass, 68% of glass is currently recycled, 51% in plastic. Glass is only slightly lower than the recycling rates of paper or metal, and that's just from our home recycling, so the curbside collection schemes or taking things back to the supermarket and putting it in their bins. So it sounds like those rates aren't that dissimilar to me. Glass is slightly better, but not by a massive amount, I'd have said. There's room for improvement in both areas, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And increasing recycling rates is definitely something where deposit return scheme could have an impact. If we look at what other countries have experienced, so in Finland, they introduced deposit return, and within 1 year, their recycling rates increased to over 90%. And in the Netherlands, they managed to reduce plastic bottle litter by 70%. So you can see places where they have deposit return schemes, it's made a really big impact. In Germany, which is going to go back and make Antonia relive her trauma. Yeah, Germany's the most successful example of deposit return scheme since implementing it in 2003, so it was ages. Their recycling rate, specifically for plastic bottles, is 98%.
98%?
Yeah,
wow.
It's pretty high.
That is impressive. Almost all the glass bottles going back out in the wild and then coming back to them.
Plastic bottles only. PET.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was thinking glass because of one time I've been to Germany and done this. It was with glass bottles that we had, and it was like a reverse vending machine. And you had to have the label on the bottle intact, which we didn't realise, and quite a few of us have been peeling the labels off. So you put it in the vending machine, and it reads, yes, it's this company's beer bottle, and the label tells me this about it. Yes, you can recycle this. So we ended up with these bottles that we couldn't get the deposit back on.
Oh no.
Yeah, I guess they could still be recycled though.
Yeah.
For glass in Germany, it's 85%. So not as high as plastic bottles, but still much higher than UK.
Yeah. I wonder if they've looked into the reasons for that, but I guess that gets us a little bit distracted. So moving back to the UK, if glass bottles are going to be excluded from the deposit return scheme, it sounds like instead they will have an extra cost charged to the drinks producer that works out at about 9p per 500ml bottle. And some drinks industry people are saying this would make glass bottle drinks too expensive for the consumer and would lead to switching to plastic, which the industry also seems to be saying that, well, if you have a deposit return scheme, that'll also make people switch to plastic, which just makes me sound like they don't want to change what they're doing.
I mean, that is likely. But I suppose if they're not applying the deposit onto the consumer, the way they're going to apply this charge is through the extended producer responsibility. Is that what that article was suggesting?
I think so, from the numbers they quoted, because I found the extended producer responsibility suggested charges per tonne of material, and it did seem to roughly work out, so I assume it is, but the article didn't specifically say.
And this is a scheme, again, that is in other countries where, as a company, you would log how much packaging material you imported or introduced to the UK market. So, say I bought 50 tons of plastic to package my things, then I would have to pay an additional however much per ton for said materials. That would put back into the recycling scheme infrastructure to improve the system, and it's an incentive to move away from excessive packaging. Hopefully the tariffs make sense in terms of environmental impact.
So I said I looked at the tables. These are only suggested ranges at the minute, so they're not set in stone. But for a heavy 500ml glass bottle, so 400 grams, charges equate to about 9p if you use the higher fee. But for plastic, a heavy one of those apparently is 40 grams. It would only be 2p a bottle. So the producer would be paying far less if they were switching to plastic rather than glass, or the retailer, I guess. It also sounds like that means that the deposit return scheme would add an additional charge. So the producer is paying something that helps improve the infrastructure for recycling, and then the deposit return scheme also has its own charge applied.
I guess that would make the scheme more complicated. But from my experience in Germany, I brought the container back to the supermarket and they just paid it me back. So in that case, what does that achieve?
No money for the industry, just encouraging the person, I guess. But I think they also assume that some people just won't bring it back, so they will make some money somewhere.
Yeah. And then I guess that is going towards the litter management or for recycling or improving recycling rates in other ways.
Maybe you would hope so.
Yeah.
But then I guess this means that the different way that glass is being treated compared to alternatives like plastic. From what we've said so far, it's partly about littering and objection by the glass industry to making things happen a certain way. And the charges suggest that plastic is somehow better than glass. But it does make me wonder which is easier to recycle. If this is the whole point of doing this, it's to get people to recycle. Which is the easier one, glass or plastic?
If we're talking about easier, are we saying it takes less energy to recycle?
We could do, I guess. I mean, you could define that as how many different steps do you have to have involved, or how complex is it to get a thing that's gone out into consumer space back to the factory and then back into being like a new product.
For both plastic and glass, recycling is pretty similar. So we use what's called mechanical recycling, where basically you need to sort out your types of packaging to certain types because you don't want contamination. And then you clean it, you cut or crush it, then you do extrusion to it. So for plastic, it's usually you just pelletize it and then you melt it and then you use that molten plastic to make new plastic. And similar with glass, you just crush it and then turn that into new glass.
Sounds relatively simple, but I guess because there are lots of different types of plastic, so you like just the base polymer like polypropylene or polyethylene, but then they get all sorts of different additives added to that might be difficult to distinguish. And from what I can tell, this mechanical recycling method doesn't remove any of those additives. And I get the impression that when you extrude the plastic, so you melt it, that added temperature can lead to a lot of bond breakage. You get reactions going on with the additives, I assume. There's some oxidation apparently, and it kind of makes the polymers get shorter, which makes them more difficult to then form into new products. I say this like I know what I'm talking about. I literally read this the other day.
The challenge then is, how do you separate materials? You can come up with some sort of clever way to try and make the feedstock as similar as possible. But would it be easier if people just sorted it at the source? When people throw it away, it's already sorted, rather than having infrared camera or flotation to work out different densities of plastic, which they're very similar. So you're not really going to get a nice clean separation. But even if you melted them down and hoped that one would float above the other, you're going to have some mixing. So yeah, it would seem to me that trying to keep plastic suitable after you've recycled it starts with the feedstock. Even the colour would be a problem, because I suppose by weight you've got more colour or the other additives relative to plastic material.
I found a journal article. It's only a few years old, so I guess it's still relatively useful. I reckon that sorting rates for plastic can vary a lot, between about 30 to 95%. And this is in the facilities that do the sorting of the plastic before sending it on to the recycling facility. And that sorting rate depends on the plastic and the technology used at this material recovery facility. And the higher rates seemed to be brought about by facilities where they used emerging technology, such as these high-definition cameras that could detect contamination. So I got the impression from reading this, and they surveyed about 5 or 6 different facilities. Their focus seemed to be on the industrial process of getting the waste back and sorting it rather than on the consumer. I often think consumers are treated a bit unfairly here, so I was quite pleased to see that. The authors also noted that these recovery facilities and the collection systems, as well as the packaging, could all be better designed if they wanted to get to the same 95% that they saw in one of the plant.
Basically, in addition to like increasing actual packaging being sent to recycling, other things need to be improved. So basically the packaging design, recycling sorting plants, and generally the whole recycling infrastructure just needs to change if you want to see really big improvements in recycling overall.
Yep, makes sense. And when plastic is recycled, see, I always assumed before I started reading into this that you would process the polymer, and I've got a bit of a background in polymer science because my PhD was modelling polymers on a computer. But I assumed that you would process the polymer by breaking it up into its monomers, its individual building blocks, and then just make them chemically react together till you made a polymer of the same length as the one that you wanted or the one that you would originally have started off with. But it sounds like most recycling schemes don't do this because they stop at just the mechanical recycling and don't go those extra chemical steps. I got the impression it's because these chemical processes are more costly and still in development.
Yes, they are.
Okay, good. I got something right.
You would have to literally break the bonds, and so what kind of energy requirement is there, and to guarantee that you break those particular bonds as opposed to, I don't know, just completely degrading the entire thing and turning it into a whole nother chemical, or just end up burning it. So people have suggested you could do this for pyrolysis. It's quite high temperature and it's in the absence of oxygen to make sure you don't burn it and turn it into a bunch of carbon.
Okay.
It's still in development. It's not really something that is used.
Yeah, I'd also seen that it's a lot easier for polymers that are made by what's known as a condensation reaction, which is essentially where you drive off some hydrogen and oxygen molecules from the monomers to make the polymer. You effectively release some water. So things like PET plastic, it could be used for because they're made by condensation reactions. The condensation reactions, it sounds like a easily reversible compared to other types of polymerization reactions.
Yeah, and I suppose PET is already widely recycled because it's one of the main plastics used for plastic drinking bottles. So if you've already got clear PET and you can just shred it and melt it, why would you go through the effort of reversing a chemical reaction?
Because then you could, in theory, infinitely just recycle that plastic bottle rather than only being able to recycle it like 2 or 3 times before it becomes unusable because the polymer chains are too short as a result of mechanical recycling.
I suppose as well as the high temperature that I suggested through pyrolysis, you could use other methods with higher temperature or with chemicals, and then it's more complicated, more costly. So you'd get extra waste.
But despite all that, even with the recycling rates that we have and with mechanical recycling, a lot of plastic drinks packaging does contain recycled plastic. So in the UK, it's legislation for all plastic packaging to have a minimum content of 30% recycled plastic.
Or you get charged more money for not meeting that.
Yeah.
It's a tax.
So producers can't just keep on extracting more oil out of the ground or byproducts of the oil industry that they can then use to make new plastics. We have to recycle some of it. It does make me wonder, though, if you only recycle plastics via mechanical methods a few times, how often can those bottles at a 30% recycled content be recycled? But I feel like I'm getting into too much detail. So I'm going to shift away from talking about plastic. And in comparison, does anyone know how much recycled glass goes back into a glass bottle?
Yeah, so there's a study carried out for the UK and they found that for a closed loop cycle, so that's glass bottles being recycled and turned into new glass bottles, it's about 36%.
Kind of similar-ish to what government is legislating for plastic.
Yeah.
That stat really surprised me because I feel like I remember seeing this said about glass and some metals that they are infinitely recyclable.
I think the operative word missing from that statement that you've probably seen floating around the internet is, in theory, it's
Yes.
infinitely recyclable, which I would imagine is the same for plastic if you went beyond mechanical recycling. I mean, I used to work on glass in the lab, so I know roughly how glass is made. So you take a really high purity starting ingredient, so your sand or your silicon dioxide, and whatever else you want to add to the glass. You stick it in a furnace at least about 600 degrees Celsius, depending on the chemical elements that you want to put in the glass. Pyrex, which is the sort of stuff you put in the oven, requires temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius to melt it. But we're talking specifically about glass bottles. They're not made of Pyrex. So I would assume you melt them at about 600 degrees C. And as Jasmin mentioned, the glass recycling process is similar to the plastics. You get the glass back from the wild, the people that have used it. You sort it somehow, you crush it, and then you stick it back into your melting process. I also read that green glass has a higher tolerance for impurities in that recycled feed, but the quality specifications of clear glass only allow 60% of recycled glass in their content because they're clear, so any defects in colour will stand out quite well, which means the colour needs to be segregated first and the contamination removed, and different types of glass going into that glass stream have to be quite limited, which I think puts an unnecessary burden on clear glass bottles, really. I don't really care if my wine bottle looks a bit of a funny colour.
Yeah, if we limit it to talking about bottles, yeah, maybe, that's why it's beneficial to have brown bottles because it's like a mix of every colour.
Yeah. And there's a reason that beer bottles are brown. It's to stop sunlight getting through, or particular wavelengths of sunlight getting through and breaking down components of the beer and making it just taste weird.
Yeah, it's the same with some cosmetics too.
Mm.
But in terms of like recycled glass versus virgin glass, like there is a benefit in terms of it reduces energy consumption and therefore carbon, but it is limited just because the melting temperature of glass that's being recycled versus virgin glass isn't that big. So there was a study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, and they found that for making bottles from 100% recycled glass, it would only be maximum 13% energy savings versus completely virgin glass. So there's a benefit, but not that big.
No, and I guess again that's because they have to get to quite a high temperature, and that's probably where a lot of their energy consumption comes from.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but I guess if that's just the process side of it, the chemical processing and the energy intensity, I guess there's more to consider if you're talking about what is best or what is the right thing to do for the environment, which is the point of the recycling in the first place. So there's things like where your starting materials come from. If you're adding recycled content to new content, how hazardous is the process? Are you creating extra jobs, other resource use? All these things are factors of sustainability, aren't they?
Yeah, but recycling has benefits, like it reduces the demand for raw virgin material, so less petroleum product demand, less silicon sand and other stuff used to make glass demand, and also lower greenhouse gas emissions because recycling does generally have lower emissions than producing things from virgin materials.
I guess you also have to think about where your factory's located. We hear quite a lot in the UK that our plastic waste is just kind of shipped off to another country and we just leave it to them to deal with in potentially unsafe conditions.
And I suppose if the producer is responsible, they might be more inclined to think about them locally because they still have to pay for buying the material in the first place and then they're paying for its end of life. Why don't we just go back to, when we used to have milk bottles delivered to our front door? They get taken away, washed, I presumed, not recycled, and then you got it refilled. Why don't we go back to that?
Good question. I can only imagine it's because that was quite a local supply chain. I don't know how far the dairy would have been from your house, but it might have only had to travel a few miles in that bottle, so it's quite a short recycling loop. I have looked into this one near me, given that there is a dairy farm near me that has a vending machine for milk.
Wow.
Yeah, they don't deliver though, so I'd have to go there myself, which I'm not sure is particularly efficient in terms of time or energy use.
And it would have been much more efficient because they were electric milk floats and they basically did the entire street.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the milkman. That was a long, long time ago. No, I live in London and I don't think anyone in my area gets milk delivered to them.
I tried getting bread delivered to me by a brand that was supposed to be sustainable, eco, all the buzzwords. But they left my bread outside of the cardboard box, and it was just in a thin plastic film
Just on your doorstep?
on my doorstep because it was too early.
Oh dear.
And they were like, if it's before 6 a.m., we're not going to ring your doorbell. By the time I got up, it had been eaten by birds.
The early bird catches the errant loaf of bread.
Yes.
Oh dear. So I feel like we've talked an awful lot about the recycling methods and how the recycled material gets to that recycling plant. And we talked way up top about why glass is being excluded from the deposit return system. And I still can't help thinking that it is just glass companies that don't really want to change what they're doing. I'm not convinced by the arguments that the industry has put forward. And I like glass. I'm a glass scientist to an extent.
I kind of can see where drinks companies come from when they use glass, because supposedly Coca-Cola spent a lot of money developing a coating to make the taste of Coca-Cola the same from a plastic bottle as it did in a glass bottle. And they have vast resource to do that. You know, ultimately, drinks company want to sell drinks that are attractive to the consumer, and people think drinks in glass bottles are of a certain quality and plastic is not.
I mean, Coca-Cola started off being sold in glass bottles as well, didn't it? And they shifted to plastic, and they must have had a reason for doing it if they had to invest research in making the drink taste the same. So would it be so far-fetched to say wine start being delivered in plastic bottles instead? Would you want wine out of a plastic bottle?
I mean, there's wine in a box, so why not? I've never seen wine in a plastic bottle, but I've definitely seen cider in a plastic bottle, i.e. the cheap one. The really cheap one.
Exactly.
I know what
The
you
wine
mean.
that comes in a plastic bottle is the one that's in the value or basics range of a supermarket. Maybe they just don't trust that it won't degrade in plastic.
And they're also concerned about plastic leaching into drinks and stuff, or chemicals leaching from plastic into drinks. Or is that only plastics with BPA?
I assumed it was just BPA because that is the one that you hear about quite a lot, don't you? And plastics aren't allowed BPA in them anymore.
What about microplastics?
Also emerging research. We've all got microplastics in our bodies anyway at this rate.
Yep, like PFAS.
But ultimately, I guess it's kind of inert in our bodies.
I think this could be another episode because I think there's a lot of research going on in that space at the minute. I've definitely seen a lot of research papers that have said plastic is in pretty much every part of your body and your body has to do something with it. Normally it just kind of encapsulates a foreign object, doesn't it? But I don't know if it would encapsulate something that's on the nano scale or the micro scale.
So we have another problem.
Potentially. I've not seen anything yet that said, yes, this person died of plastic pollution.
We know it affects animals, though.
Smaller animals. I don't know why that's relevant because I'm sure the length scale of their cells is the same as humans. I feel like that's probably a good place to leave it though, because we've gone way off topic now.
Yep.
So we're kind of saying the glass bottle industry doesn't necessarily want to change. And the glass industry suggests that recycling rate is already high, even though bottles can't really be made from 100% recycled material. We also recognise that plastic recycling processes could definitely be improved by quite a lot. So there's a lot more science to go there, a lot more engineering. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.